in this episode?
So I guess I kind of have a simple argument. It's just that I think we follow the teachings of Jesus. We follow the teachings of all the main saints from the from early Christianity. That I think that a a politics that doesn't focus on ensuring the well-being of all people and that doesn't focus on trying to better the lives of all people just seems alien. Just seems alien from the tradition, and so I just kind of engage with that.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with Hunter Coates. This is in fact his third appearance on the podcast, and he's also the guest who's been on the podcast the most number of times. As per usual, it was a enlightening one. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I recall our first conversation about almost a year and a half ago was on Lacan and psychoanalysis, and he really did help me understand some of the key concepts of psychoanalytic theory and Lacanianism. And now we've moved on to fully discussing theology since his recent conversion to Orthodox Christianity. And I gotta say, people like Hunter, his ilk, for lack of a better term, are quite an interesting one. It's an interesting type because, you know, he's well read in Hegel and Lacan and theory and philosophy, and then he juxtaposes these ideas and kind of brings these ideas into a new eye or to a new perspective uh, through his Christianity and his Orthodox Christianity in particular. And we discussed Traden, of course, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, and even had a dialogue with Peter Rollins. And I always find it fascinating how these thinkers they come to Christ, as they say, and then how there's like a renewed way that they view philosophy and psychoanalysis and theory, and it's just I find it endlessly fascinating and riveting to just understand these concepts. But apart from that, this conversation was specifically on universalism, universal salvation, and Christian socialism, as Hunter wrote two papers on these two topics. And he is a universalist, which I believe is what I think I myself am aligning more towards, especially after reading Hunter's work and Hunter's paper. The good news is he's writing a book on universalism. In any case, I hope you do find this conversation as enlightening as I did. But of course, as I tend to do before we get to the conversation, a bit of a formal introduction for Hunter. Hunter Coates is an Orthodox Christian theologian, undergraduate student, and aspiring academic. Currently, he is pursuing a philosophy and history double BA at Georgia College and State University. After graduation, he plans to work towards a PhD in philosophy. In February 2023, Hunter published his first full-length text titled Conspiracy and the Subject, a Lacanian Enterprise, which we discussed in the previous podcast I had with him. And he will be publishing Grace Abounds, a holistic case for universalism by the end of 2024, which I am eagerly awaiting to read. Having said that, without further ado, here's my conversation with Hunter Coates. How's life been, man? How's life been since your conversion to Christianity the past couple of months?
It's been I mean pretty good. Like a lot's changed. Like just sort of I guess kind of my attitude towards life, how I like spend my time, certain activities I don't do anymore, like sin all that, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I know it's there's definitely change. Like it's I don't know how to explain it, but it's something when like you feel grace, it really makes you want to change. It isn't just like a mental acceptance, and that was one of the major things that I had to really. I mean, we're kind of getting into more of the talk, but I guess we're recording. That's fine.
No,
Yeah,
we're recording. We could just get started. Anyway, as you would know,
yeah,
I do record a separate introduction to this, so it's all good. In
true.
fact, I think in one of your papers, you refer to the ontological shift that happens with theosis.
Yes.
There's this kind of it's not. I think it's quite let's call it unique or distinct to orthodoxy, where
Yes.
in fact when you become a Christian, there's a ontological difference that takes place in you.
Hmm.
You wrote about this in the salvation paper, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I mean, look, primarily what I want to discuss are the papers on Christian socialism and the one on universalism, which
Perfect.
I'm very much looking forward to. But just curious, man. So, obviously you're a very philosophically minded thinker. You're a very psychoanalytically and philosophically minded thinker. Yeah, I probably did ask you this in our previous conversation too, but since it's been a couple of months, how has your views of the, let's call the big three influences in your life, Hegel, Lacan, and Žižek,
Yeah, yeah. Um,
how has the views of those thinkers changed ever since your conversion to Christianity?
yeah. For Hegel, I'd say Hegel's probably changed the most. I think Hegel, I keep trying to figure out what what kind of value he brings anymore, and I really can't. One of the only things that I still really like is this idea that being is nothing. I still really like that idea. And I know that my friend Trey, you've talked to Telos Bound before.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Trey has done some stuff. He's verified with me because he hasn't actually read Hegel. So he's like, "Is this what Hegel says?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's what he says." So, but he basically has this thing where he says that, okay, when Hegel says that being is nothing, what Hegel really means is that like self-identification is, if you have a self-relating self-identification, that itself is nothing. So you have to have an other for an identification to be created. And then for a Christian viewpoint, that other is God and that other is the neighbor. Because as Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love the neighbor as yourself. So then you kind of have two others in that sense. You have God as the ultimate other, the big other, to use a Lacan term, and then you have the neighbor as like the small o other. And this is kind of that avoiding that self-relation. And for Trey, I believe self-relation is sin. Sin is ultimate self-relation because it is sort of taking yourself away from the neighbor and away from God and focusing on your pride and focusing on your own desires. So I accept a lot of what Trey gets to with that sort of paradigm. So I would just say that that is sort of where I take Hegel. When it comes to Lacan, it's a similar thing. I'm currently writing a paper for a women gender studies class about uh sort of tying Lacan to mystical experience. So my thesis is that mystical experience understood in the way that Lacan does, it's pretty a Roman Catholic view, is that it uses Lacan uses the ideas of other jouissance and that underlying all subjectivity is hysteria. So these two ideas, they kind of come together, and I think his best presentation on mysticism in Seminar 20. And then I kind of take that and run with it and then develop it further through the Bible. So yeah, that's kind
Interesting. I
of
mean,
something I'm
I
working on right
certainly
now.
think, yeah, because Trey, as you point out, I've spoken to him a couple of times. In fact, I was in moderating a dialogue between him and Peter Rollins, and the big
Yeah.
thing with Trey, he comes at this more from the Žižekian angle, the idea that self-relation is ultimate hell
Yes.
without the
Yeah.
other, and he, I think, sort of articulates it really well in his work too.
Hmm.
Oh, I'm curious because I'm sure you've read some of Todd McGovern's work, and Todd
Yeah.
McGovern's quite big on the idea that Hegel's essential idea is that being as such is contradictory, that we
Mhm.
can't that contradiction exists not just in thought but is inherent to being itself.
Mhm.
So, what are your views on that whole idea that being, including the absolute, is rife with contradiction?
Yeah, I agree. I think God is a paradox in every way. I take a lot of current theologians who I look up to, like David Bentley Hart, sort of resist this idea that God is a paradox. But other theologians like John Milbank, who I will be interviewing in April, very looking
Yes,
forward to
I
that.
saw the announcement. Yeah, congrats on
Yeah,
that. That'd be a
yeah, it's going to
fantastic
be really cool.
conversation. Looking forward to that.
Yeah. So his whole thing is kind of like God is a paradox and paradoxes are true. He talked about this in his text with Žižek that they wrote together in 2008, which I think Milbank came out much better than Žižek on that, because Milbank really reads Hegel. He really reads Lacan, and I don't think Žižek spends as much time on Christian thinkers as Milbank does on secular thinkers. Um, so I take Milbank's view for a lot of that. But the point would be that um, God is a paradox, and that we can't think of God as sort of a thing that like exists, like a microphone on my table or a chair. He's sort of beyond being in any understandable sense. And I think that when we understand God as beyond being, it allows us to situate ourselves to the divine more, like more. I guess it makes more sense. And it also allows us to kind of differentiate God from every finite thing, because what you see a lot of times among, maybe we'll say, like, to use the term, I guess I'll use a Reddit atheist, people that are, they haven't really read a lot of the philosophy on atheism, but they have, big, God is a wizard in the sky, that type of attitude. Is that they think of God in this very finite sense. God is a guy in the sky who's an old man with a beard, right? And that's just so silly, and it's completely disconnected from like, even definitely ancient religion, but modern religion as well. And that's just not the way that believers think of God. Is this guy in the sky? It's a paradox, because he exists, but he doesn't exist in the same way that other things do in this world. Um, he exists as sort of, I mean, I guess I'm quite privy to use the language from Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, when he says that God is best understood as a series of divine names: love, good, wisdom, beauty, true, consciousness. All these names themselves are God. And it isn't like we can say that they're a part of God. It isn't like we can say that, like, all of them together make up God, that if you remove one of them, then you don't get God. It's a very, very rationalist way of thinking. No, they all are God at once. And it's sort of, it's hard to grasp that until you really experience what that feels like, to be in the presence of that, to experience that, to be around that. And it really makes sense at that point. Which is why I suppose we use the language of ineffability when something is unable to be spoken, unable to be thought about, even, has to be experienced. And I think that that is one thing that Orthodoxy really envisions, is this experience of God, um, rather
Yeah.
than just like a mental conception, theoretical ideas about God. It's an experience. So,
Yeah, beautifully put. In fact, one part that spoke out to me, and not to jump the gun here, but in your paper on universal salvation, was that
Mhm.
said that God isn't just good. God is the good itself. Like
Yes.
there's no
Yeah.
differentiation between good and God. God is good, and
Mhm.
that in that kind of
Mhm.
shift, because when you say God is good, that makes it look as if it's like a trait of God, or like the way you say
Yeah.
a human being is a good person. It kind of reduces it in some sense,
Yeah.
qualitatively. Um, yeah, look, obviously, the primarily what I want to discuss are your papers, but I'm still curious. I already asked this question from Trey Hunter, because personally, as you know, I'm in no way, I still, in some sense, consider myself a Christian. In no way am I turned off from Christianity. I'm deeply interested in it. But when I spoke to Trey and even yourself from our previous conversation, there always is this personal revelation. There's a personal story that's not merely, let's call it, kind of like an intellectual, systematic shift in one's thinking. And personally for me, I've never had any kind of spiritual revelations, or whatever you may call it. I haven't had any kind of ontological shifts in who I am as a person when it comes to the divine. So this got me thinking, especially after the conversation Peter and Trey had, because they went on and on for about 2.5 years, 2.5 hours, sorry, about this. It probably could go on for that long if I wanted to end the conversation that day, but uh, uh, about the idea of, yeah, theologically, they brought up all this idea of contradiction, and Peter saying that salvation is saying there's no salvation, and so on. And then ultimately what I realized was, yes, they have well thought out, systematic, uh rationalistic ways of thinking about their theology and their philosophy. But then the thing with Trey is he himself has had some kind of personal revelation.
Mhm.
So, well, firstly, just how would you, I mean, I know you can't put words to such a thing, it's ineffable, but how would you at least try and articulate what this kind of personal revelation is? But then also, for those like myself who haven't had it, yet, or who knows, who may never have it, but then that I disagree with because of your idea of, universal salvation. But just for the people who haven't had it, what would you say? Like, are they supposed to kind of live life in this uh detachment from God for the rest of their life, or is there a way out, so to speak?
Yeah. I I mean, when I first had mine, I was definitely detached from God. It was I've told you about it before. I don't really want to go into it again. It was
That's fine.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I'm
yeah.
gonna link the
It's
previous conversation anyway, so we've spoken about this. Yeah.
yeah, it's at the last conversation if you guys want to go back and watch that. But that was sort of like the tipping point. I mean, since then it's sort of the saints talk a lot about this idea that as you grow closer to God, every moment in itself kind of has that spark of God in it. Like no matter where you are, you can feel God and you feel that like you are encountering God. Even in like terrible times, like I recently had poison ivy over the weekend. But
Yes.
like
How are you feeling, by
one
the
of
way? Are
I'm
you?
feeling much better. I took
That's,
medicine
yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm
That's
good.
scary. Yeah.
Yeah, I luckily got I stopped it early, but
That's
yeah, it definitely that stuff can get pretty scary. But one of the first thoughts I had was like, why did I get poison ivy? Like not like what like did I walk into a plant, but like why? Like what's the real reason why I got poison ivy? And I mean that was just the first thing I thought was like, well, this sucks and I don't like it, but like what was the reason? And I realized, oh, maybe like I haven't been going outside more. This is sort of like a thing that, oh, God wants me to go outside more. So then on Friday, I went and did this wonderful walk in nature, just by myself, by a little hiking trail by my university. I walked for 2 hours, ended up getting lost, but that itself gave me another opportunity to think, why did I get lost? Right. And just praying in nature, just in this constant mode of prayer, just walking by myself in nature. And I realized that, like, looking back to that poison ivy experience, I would not have done that if I didn't get poison ivy. And so it's just this sort of that's just like a very small example, but it's just sort of a continual apperception of God um, that you that you feel eventually at some point in your spiritual journey. And the cool thing that St. Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 3:18 is that all of our spiritual journeys are infinite. We go from glory to glory, as he says. So this isn't like a peak. It isn't like there's no peak to a spiritual journey. You just continue and continue and grow closer and closer and closer and closer. And I think it's beautiful that there's no like idea of an end. Um, there's always more to experience. And so, um, yeah, I guess to answer the question now, would be I think just leaving your mind open. Um, yeah, I mean, I get these experiences randomly. I was on Facebook last night, and one of my good friends who is in this theology circle, guy named Jesse Hake, really good guy. He posted this Facebook comment about the Last Judgment. If anyone knows about the Last Judgment, it tends to be this like heavily feared thing in Christian circles. It's talked about with like all this scary language. And he gave a story from 1408 when two Russian iconographers created a mural on a cathedral in Russia, but their mural of the Last Judgment didn't have any of the normal fear stuff. It didn't have a lake of fire. It didn't have hell. It just had Jesus pouring out his light with the angels to all the people that were waiting for him to come to earth. And all the people, there were no frightful faces. Everyone was looking with like eyes of wonder. And like reading that, not even seeing it. Once I saw it, I started crying more. But just reading that, like tears just formed in my eyes, and I just like felt this utter sense of just like bliss and connectedness to like what I was feeling. And it's hard to explain, but I get those feelings a lot now when I read something beautiful, um when I see something inspiring. That that's like a participation in God. God is beauty. When you see something beautiful, you're participating in God in that sense. When you see something inspiring, you're participating in wisdom. You're participating in something else that is him. And So yeah, I suppose that just leaving your mind open and to these types of experiences. Um, yeah. So
Yeah, it's beautifully put, Hunter. Because I think, especially, in our like kind of postmodern times, as Nietzsche said, after the death of God, let's call it the symbolic death of God. God isn't
mhm.
dead. But I find the easiest thing to do is to be cynical and close yourself off to beauty and truth and all these, let's call them eternal ideas, eternal ideals, and just be like, oh, it's all nonsense, it's made up, not these days. Art is considered AI art is considered art. I mean, it's quite farcical. Says that the ultimate irony is that it is in our times where we ostensibly think, we're these enlightened beings in modernity who are like rationalistic thinkers. I think we're the most close-minded.
Mhm.
In
Yeah.
It's quite.
Yeah, I currently with the essay I'm finishing up right now on the existence of fairies, I would agree. I think that ancient people were much more open to experiencing parts of the world that are out there. And when you're more open to experiencing parts of the world, that you have conceptual categories created for parts of the world, you can experience them. When we don't have conceptual categories for created, we can't then go and experience things. One of the examples I give, not to get too off track, is a microscope. The microscope was discovered in the late 16th century. But before the microscope was discovered / developed, you had to have this idea that there was something more to the world. You had to have this conceptual category of a microscopic realm. And to have this conceptual category, you didn't have any evidence for it. You had people in the 16th century who had this idea that there was more to see in the world, but they had no evidence to prove this, right? But to have the idea to have the invention of the microscope, you have to have this category first, that there is more to experience. And this, I tie this into the idea of fairies, is that we haven't found fairies today. We can't find fairies today because we've shut our minds off from that conceptual category of intermediary beings that exist in the world that are spiritual beings in some sense. We've shut ourselves off from this. And so to think that we could just develop a microscope to see them or develop, some other scientific medium is ludicrous because we've shut ourselves from that conceptual category. We first have to accept that category exists, commit ourselves to it, and then only then can we engage in trying to find a medium which will allow us to verify and experience these creatures. So
Beautiful put, beautiful put. All right, Hunter, before we get to your papers, I've still got two more questions. One is a bit of a personal one. I think it's worth mentioning. Perhaps we could get a bit of a teaser into your upcoming book, Grace
mhm,
Abounds, a holistic case for universalism. So
mhm.
you're hoping to release that by the end of this year, 2024. Am I right?
Yeah, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. So hopefully, yeah, you'll probably be on again to discuss that. I would love to. In fact, I gotta say, you've introduced me to a lot of, just by following your work online, to a lot of theological categories. But from all that you've introduced me to, my favorite has to be the idea of Christian universalism, because as you've highlighted in your paper, as a kid, what turned me off, I wouldn't say just Christianity, but perhaps all of the monotheistic religions, was
Mhm.
this idea that there's hell. Like, what kind of sadistic God would send people for eternal suffering? I just couldn't
Yeah.
fathom the idea that this was, if God was good, this was the case. I
Mhm.
mean, look, let's be honest, you could rationalize anything. You could get like
People
some
do.
people
People
do,
do.
right? You could get some apologists saying, oh, it's justice, whatnot. But at the end of the day, the affect that leaves on a person, you can't just
Mhm.
shut that off, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but the last question would be, and I wanted to ask this from Trey, and I probably have asked him this question in different ways, but I think you're also the perfect person to ask this from, especially because you read Kierkegaard. So how would your Christianity differ from that of a Christian existentialist like a Paul Tillich or a Kierkegaard?
So I'm gonna answer the first question, kind of talk about my book, and then I'll go into
Yeah, of course, both, please.
Kierkegaard.
Thank you. Yeah.
The second one's gonna be much shorter. So I do a couple of things with my book. I call it a holistic case for universalism because I make the case from scripture, tradition, and philosophy. I do all three. And I kind of lay out a systematic theology of universalism in the first part. So the first part of the book is called an Orthodox Trinitarian theology, and it just lays out a systematic theology. What is atonement? What is salvation? What is God? All of this stuff is laid out in 65, 70 pages. Then we go to part two. Part two is called Universalism and Holy Tradition. This is the very long part. This is, oh gosh, 375 pages, probably, something like that. This involves, so this is, I guess, yeah, so it begins with discussing what kind of hermeneutical position should we take to the Bible? How should we read the Bible? What does this mean, and how does this influence our theology? So I kind of give a chapter on that. Then I give what I consider to be my most accomplished chapter, which is my quasi-Pauline warrant for universalism, where I look at texts from Paul and texts that are attributed to Paul that he probably didn't write. I look at 5 texts. Those texts are 1 Corinthians 15:20 to 28, Romans 5:18, Philippians 2:10 to 11, and Colossians 1:20. And the surrounding verses are on there too, but those are the main things. It's maybe about 95 pages, this chapter. It's big. And I basically lay out arguments against what I've taken to be the vast majority of the 30 years of biblical scholarship on these texts. I try and engage with all the major commentaries and works on these texts, and try and figure out okay, what are their arguments? How can we read this word? Because I've started learning Greek, so I can read Greek now, and so okay, how are they understanding this? How are they taking this text? What is the grammatical construction that they're engaging in? What is their assumptions? Are they forgetting certain texts? There's many times where a Greek word, someone will use a Greek word, Paul will use a Greek word, and we try and figure out what that word means. And what we do, the first thing that usually scholars do is they go, well, let's look at what other writings of Paul says where that word makes more sense, and then we can use those uses of the word in other writings to make sense of a use in a more difficult writing, a more difficult context that doesn't make sense. So I kind of go, okay, let's do that. Let's take this Greek word. Where does Paul use it? Where does the Old Testament use it in the Greek translation Septuagint? Where is it used in any other parts of the New Testament? How was the verb used? And these types of things really matter, because when it comes to the New Testament, a lot of the words used are very similar to the ones in the Septuagint, and they have similar meanings. You don't tend to have one word being used in an entirely opposite way from how it was used in the Septuagint. Or sometimes you have that between Paul's writings and the later writings in the New Testament, but very rarely, if Jesus uses a word, Paul uses the word, it's going to be the same thing most likely. And so I kind of make the case okay, these arguments against universalism for these texts that I just named are full of special pleading. They're full of just ad hoc arguments that make no sense, that are just trying to reason out the unreasonable. It is obvious that these texts are universalist. They're obviously talking about a universal reconciliation of some sort. They're obviously talking about, in the case of Romans 5:18, you have, through Adam all have died, through Christ all shall be made alive. This is obviously a parallel that everyone died through Adam, everyone will be made alive through Christ. There is no other way to look at this. And you have so many people that give these crazy hypotheses, these just nonsense stuff, and I just deconstruct them, and I'm like, this is just silly. The text doesn't say this. The grammatical construction of the text doesn't say this. The writings of the fathers commenting on the text doesn't say this, right? So that's that chapter. That chapter is, I think it's magnificent. I'm really proud of it. The next 3 chapters are much more, let's say, scholarly, in that I'm not really making a theological argument. I'm engaging in textual analysis of the Bible. So the next chapter is on the idea of hell. What is hell, and where is it talked about in the Bible? Well, I discuss how in the Old Testament, hell's not really there. you have this term called Sheol, and the Sheol is just sort of like the abode of the dead. But there's a lot of contradictions between the way that Sheol is depicted throughout the Old Testament. And because the idea of the afterlife evolved over time in Jewish history. And early Jewish history, when they were more closer to like a polytheistic religion, 6th century, 7th century, 6th century, you have archaeological discoveries. I engage with those that show that, oh, we're seeing very similar like burial rituals that Egyptians had, where people were buried with rooms in their tombs, right? Because the idea was that you live in your tomb in the afterlife, and this very Egyptian idea. And so okay, so that's a big contradiction from a later Jewish text. And I kind of engage in that. And then I say, let's look at the New Testament. Let's compare some text for hell. What is hell in the New Testament? Well, there's not one term that is ever called hell in the New Testament. For anyone that has, looked into this, you know that there are 3 terms. You have Hades, which is just the Greek translation of Sheol, the word I just mentioned from the Old Testament. You have Gehenna, which is sort of this borrowed idea of in the Old Testament, it was referred to as the Valley of Hinnom, which is it's a literal valley you can visit today on the southwest of Jerusalem. And Gehenna became this sort of metaphor for divine punishment that Jesus used and that early rabbi schools used in the 1st century. And so I engage with, okay, early rabbi schools use this, Jesus uses this, other texts from the 1st century BC from Judaism use this. How can we understand what Jesus means, taking all this into account? And so I try and engage with some points like, okay, what does this word mean in the context? What could Jesus mean here? And then I go on to the other idea, which is other than Gehenna, the last term is Tartarus. Tartarus refers to this sort of, I mean, it's literally like, it's from Hellenistic philosophy. It's the idea of a spiritual prison under the earth where evil spirits are kept. It comes straight from Homer. And so I engage with that, and that's used once in the entire New Testament. And so I just show like, well, that's silly. That obviously doesn't mean hell. And my conclusion is basically the idea that we have today of hell is found nowhere in the New Testament. So to criticize me for my views, you yourself have to admit that you are also not following the scriptures. No one's following the scriptures, because the literal meaning of what this is completely alien to anything we believe. None of us believe that hell is under the earth, and none of us believe that there is a spiritual prison under hell, under the earth. So you have hell under the earth, then you have another prison under the earth where other spiritual beings are. Like these aren't things people believe anymore. So my point is just to show all this and be like, okay, it's absurd for you to criticize a universalist for, not following the scriptures, quote unquote, which I think we are anyway, but to not follow the scriptures when you don't believe in the hell of the scriptures, right? So that's it's a maybe 35, 40 pages. Then I go into the harrowing of Hades, which is a really under-discussed event in the New Testament that I would, if I surveyed Christians, I don't think 70% of Christians in the West would know what the harrowing of Hades is. It is taken out of many Protestant confessions of faith. The Westminster Confession of Faith doesn't have it. None of the Baptist ones do. The Anglican one does. But the idea is that between Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, the early Christians were trying to figure out, why did he wait 3 days to, come back from the dead, right? So there's this waiting period, as we know, in the New Testament, it talks about 3 days, he rose. So the idea was, what was he doing those 3 days? So early Christians came up with this idea that he was freeing the souls of Hades, the souls that were trapped in Hades. And so the idea is that in a modern context where we don't think Hades is literally under the earth, it's that Jesus spiritually went and freed the souls that were in Hades, those wicked souls. And so I engage with the New Testament text on this. There's only 2 texts in the New Testament. Well, sorry, there's one that references it explicitly in 1 Peter, and then there's a couple of indirect ones. There's one in Ephesians, and then there's one in Matthew, and there's maybe one more that's debated. So I engage with these texts, and then I engage with, I think, the most interesting part of the chapter, early Christian apocrypha. I look at two texts specifically from the 3rd century, the Questions of Bartholomew and Questions of Bartholomew. There's one more. I have to think. Let me think. Questions of Bartholomew and is it the Apocalypse of? No, it's not Apocalypse of Peter. I forgot the other text. I wrote this 4 months ago. But yeah,
Fair
so I
enough.
engage with two
Read the book.
texts.
Read the book.
Yeah.
When the books are read,
We'll
it's
save it.
all going to be in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I engage with these two texts and I show pretty, I think, correctly that what we see in these texts is over time in Christian history, a committed effort by scribes to remove the idea of universalism from the text. When we look at older manuscripts of the text from like the 3rd to 5th century, we see like it very clearly says Jesus preached to all people and all people were saved, or it says stuff like then Jesus preached to everyone, and Adam and all of the human race came up and praised him. Right? That's clearly universalist. Well, when we look at later iterations of the text written by later scribes in other languages, we see very, I think, pretty clear indications that these were committed efforts to erase this idea. And this is probably the most, like, I don't know, scholarly part of the chapter, because I'm engaging a lot with textual criticism. Bart Ehrman is one of my, I sort of build on his argument that he makes in his 2022 text. I build on his argument, and then I also engage with some earlier text. But yeah, so that's a pretty not interesting. I mean, it's interesting to me, but I think it's just fascinating.
Sure is interesting, man. I mean, look, obviously, as I did mention before, I'd like to have you on again to discuss your book in detail once I have read it. Because I'm not even close to the kind of theological knowledge that you have, so I first need to understand the ideas. But I like how you systematically build up your arguments. I think that's quite important, especially. So, would this be a book for more of a lay audience, or do you think it's still perhaps not?
No, I think parts of it.
Yeah, like
parts of
all books. I mean, you could say that about
like
Heidegger
all
being
books.
in time. Every book,
Yeah.
parts of it. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, look, regardless, we'll discuss it. But that's great to hear. Well, I mean, look, you said your answer to this question is quite short, so might as well just ask it. The difference between your kind of Orthodox Christianity and then Christian existentialism.
Yeah. So one, I would say that I think grouping Kierkegaard and Tillich is an assault to Kierkegaard. I do not group them together. I think Tillich is a pretty
hot takes
worthless.
Here.
Yeah, Tillich's a pretty worthless thinker. I think he's not a very smart person. I don't think he accomplished much. It doesn't seem he knows much about Christian history or the Bible for that matter. So I don't really have anything good to say on him. I mean, he just was kind of I don't know. He was just sort of trying to do the thing where you read Heidegger and then you say, okay, how can we understand the Bible through Heidegger and take away everything that is about God and that is just and make it solely about the person, which, to use I guess a word from Trey, that seems like utter self-relation. That seems like hell is taking everything away from God and viewing it about the person. So viewing the resurrection as like I think it was like the replenishment of subjectivity, I think is what he said. The replenishment of subjectivity is the resurrection. Every day you replenish the subjectivity and you focus on the hope for a better world. And I mean, it's just I don't really care about that. But I think Kierkegaard is a great thinker. Kierkegaard is awesome. I have a maybe about 6 pages. It's about 6, 7 pages. A very small essay in the last chapter of the book about Kierkegaard being what I call a hopeful universalist, someone who didn't commit himself to universalism, but probably thought it would happen just because it will. And so I think he didn't commit himself to it, but I think that he probably thought it would happen. So I like Kierkegaard for his, I guess, views on love. I like his view of the story of Isaiah, of the story of Eric. Yeah, I got it over here.
Yeah, it's
Um,
you mentioned this in so much of your writing. I had to order it. I just started on it. In fact, I'm kind of in the middle of
yeah.
it. Beautifully written. I love the parts where he discusses loving thy neighbor, how much of a radical commandment that is by Jesus.
Mhm.
Sorry to interrupt, Hunter. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I like his stuff on love. Like his stuff on Abraham and Isaac. Um, I was recently reading his journals. His unpublished journals are fascinating. He engaged with a lot of ideas that he never put in books, but they're like really cool. And he commented on like the theological orthodoxy of his day and critiqued them, but he feared that like, if he publishes that, he'll get backlash. And so, yeah, I think Kierkegaard is a very, very good thinker. And I would not want to diminish his name by putting him with Tillich.
That's understandable. Yeah.
So,
But
yeah.
so like I guess just to get back to let's leave aside the names in some sense, but like at least as to how Christian existentialism is understood colloquially,
Mhm.
how would your kind of Orthodox Christianity differ from Christian existentialism?
Um, I guess if Christian existentialism involves the removal of God, then I guess it would differ in that way. I mean, Kierkegaard
It's a big
didn't,
that's a big difference. Yeah.
but I mean, I wouldn't say Kierkegaard is a Christian existentialist then. He believes in God, definitely.
So most certainly. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Well,
I think,
I was even thinking of Trey's notion of communal ontology, which
yes.
I'm deeply I'd
Yeah, I
say
like that.
yeah attuned to. So and I don't see a lot of that in a lot of the existentialist thinkers in any way. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
excellent, excellent. All right. On the note, Hunter, let's get to your papers. So, just a bit of I guess a heads up for you. Look, my audience, there are a lot of Christians for sure, because I
Mhm.
deeply engage with Christianity. Well, I wouldn't say deeply, but I try my best at least. But still, the majority of the audience are going to be secular. So I'm hoping, as you discuss your work, you could probably keep that in mind, that at the end of the day it's a secular audience that are listening to some of the concepts,
Mhm.
and some of the terms, like for instance theosis would probably be a bit alien to them. Having said that, though, let's start off, since we discussed universalism a little bit, apropos your book. Let's start off with your paper on Christian socialism, which was again well argued and clearly written. So the title of the paper is On Earth as in Heaven: Orthodox Spirituality and Eschatology in Christian Socialism. So the link to the paper is in the description down below. You can read it on Hunter's academia account. But yeah, just as a prelude, if you could give us an introduction as to what is Christian socialism, and then perhaps what do you argue for in this paper. But just on a side note, I do want to add here, as I was reading it, I realized again we live in times of profound irony, that so-called Christians are the most right-wing, pro-capitalist types, whereas whenever, at least my understanding of Christianity has been the opposite of that, the opposite
Mhm.
of kind of this like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of neoliberal capitalist ideology of Thatcher and Reagan. And then obviously reading a paper like this from a Christian was a breath of fresh air. But yes, sorry for being long-winded. Having said that, what do you argue for in this paper? Right.
Yeah. So I guess I kind of have a simple argument. It's just that I think we follow the teachings of Jesus. We follow the teachings of all the main saints from the from early Christianity. That I think that a a politics that doesn't focus on ensuring the well-being of all people, and that doesn't focus on trying to better the lives of all people, just seems alien. Just seems alien from the tradition, and so I just kind of engage with that. Um, yeah.
So how would you, my first response to this, and I'm not saying I'm claiming this, I don't take this line of thinking, or follow this line of thinking. Kind of the people that say, oh, Christians shouldn't be political, church and state, render unto Caesar what Caesar's, render unto God what's God's.
Mhm.
Christianity is ironically like a secular religion, where there should be a separation between politics and religion. How would, and therefore, these ideas like Christian socialism they're flawed. How would you respond to someone who claims that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just disagree. I think if someone has a religion that you want to put that religion in society, it's your value system. People that don't have a religion have their own value system, and they want to put that into society. And so I don't see a difference here. Yeah.
Amazing. So the other question I had was, and I think here's where your Hegelianism is coming in. You said that you're a socialist, but not a Marxist. And I think
Yeah.
you connected that to the idea of the state. So perhaps if you could kind of elucidate, firstly, what you mean by the state, and as to why, to be a Christian socialist, we need something like a state.
Yeah. I mean, I think a state. I mean, I would just take a pretty basic definition. Would be a entity with a monopoly of force. Pretty basic. Entity with a monopoly of force, has judicial, has legislative bearings, has sovereignty over a geographical area. I mean, pretty standard definitions. And I think my main point of a state is the economics of it is that I think that distribution without a state authority just becomes anarchic and chaotic and doesn't make sense. I think you have to have a state authority to ensure distribution, not to distribute everything. I don't support a fully planned economy, but distribute the main things that the market can't cover, and distribute quite a bit that the market can't cover, I guess. And I think that there's a deeper reason for a state too, is that a state sort of functions as that figurehead of order in society. And societies that don't have order are more prone to being, overtaken by, I guess, malevolent spiritual forces is how I would put it. When you accept Christianity and you really take it seriously and you read Paul's writings, there's clearly an idea that order and chaos are not words that we throw around. They are deeply metaphysical concepts. And when we use the word an ordered society, it isn't just like things are running well on the surface. There is something deeper, a metaphysical, spiritual underlying order that is there. When we talk about chaos, civil war, like a society that has civil war, it's not just like, oh, people are, it's hard to get to work because the public transit system's down because there's a civil war. There's something deeper there, that is prolonging that chaos and that is underlying that chaos. And I think that to have an ordered society, you have to have a state to maintain that order. So yeah.
Understood. So while I was reading this, of course, at least in contemporary times, the idea of socialism is still very much a secular idea in some sense. Like people who would consider themselves socialist would probably think, the church is a tyrannical, entity and institution, that it's power, and kind of make like a Foucauldian critique of it, perhaps. Well, in the idea of Christian socialism, how would Christian socialism in an ontological sense differ from, let's say, secular socialism?
Yeah. Yeah, man, the order is a part of it. Recognizing that there's a need for a state, is one of them, but also that the state has a moral, virtuous function. That the state is not meant to just exist on the outskirts, but the state has a role as being the head authority figure over the society. And you could even use Hegel's idea of the state as sort of that singularity that sort of tops off the moment of particularity, that is the various civil organizations, civil institutions, the family. The state with that ruler is the singularity that ensures that it functions, it ensures that everything works well. And so yeah, I think I guess so. Yeah, I guess one of the ontological things when it would come to the moral thing would be probably theosis would be what I'm thinking of. It's a theosis. A lot of people think of spiritual development in the West as a change in someone's like moral attitude, basically. Like when we think of what's a good person, that's someone who's like nice and like cheerful and maybe like gives to charity sometimes and helps out. Um, and that's sort of what someone would say being a good Christian is. If you asked your run-of-the-mill Christian in the West, what's a good Christian? Oh, they give to charity, you know, they do that. But when Orthodoxy and Eastern tradition thinks about being a good Christian, quote unquote, it isn't a moral thing. It's a much deeper thing. It's a yeah, I mean, the word theos is the best word. Theosis in Greek literally means becoming God. Theo and then sis, theo, God, sis, becoming, right? So it's it's a much deeper understanding of moral development and the way that communities function. If you have a community that is set on the purpose of growing in God, it isn't just like becoming better people. It's becoming gods. You are changing your human nature, in a very, very literal sense. There are the parts of your nature that are fallen. They are being chipped away, and grace is pouring through, and you're taking part in building that spiritual body that Paul talks about in Ephesians and First Corinthians, and you're 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 accessing something that most people don't have. There's this rift that blocks people from accessing this. And when you grow closer to God through this community function, through having a state that is centered on Christian socialism, it's changing something in all the people there. Yeah, that's the best way I can put it.
No, beautifully put. It's I feel like a concept like theosis, because what I found, and you do outline it quite well in your writings, but it's also something I found that we need to personally meditate on. It's not something that just like this is the definition of theosis, like propositionally, you know what theosis is. It's just an idea that you gotta constantly meditate on and see what this means. And even for me, I don't even know if I'm experiencing it in any way, but I find there's something, yeah, the word I'd use is beautiful, and the idea of that ontological shift in a person. And you know, in a way, again, in our cynical times, it's a hopeful idea. That's a beautiful thing. I don't think we should be averse to hope in any way. Well, another question I had about the idea of when I was reading this was, so the concept of the other. So let me you know, bring up like a very hot button issue. Let's take LGBTQ people, right? I mean, so obviously, especially in the United States, there's a lot of I'd say overt transphobia, you know, kind of portraying people in these communities as being like pedophiles or like predators, which I find appalling and vile. But then, firstly, you're a Christian universalist, so all are saved. But along those lines, let's say apropos some kind of society that has Christian socialism, how would we account for the other, for the minority, for the whoever you may call it, you know, the LGBTQ person or the migrant or whoever? How does such a state account for the other?
Yeah, I think that a state accounts. I think that type of state accounts for the other because Jesus accounted for the other. And so I think that when you follow the teachings of Jesus, you are going to account for the other intrinsically. I mean, yeah, Jesus was an immigrant. Is according to, I guess, I think the Matthew's account would be the one where his family fled Bethlehem and went to Egypt, right? Yeah, so I mean, he's an immigrant. he left Egypt, and when he went to Egypt, I doubt he was waiting for the border patrol to check him and all that, right? He went to Egypt because he was fleeing political turmoil. So yeah, I think that question kind of is answered by just following the teachings of him. I think that kind of just fills in that question.
Christ. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that does beg the question, Ante. I mean, look, speculate away here because I haven't really read any of your work on any of your writings on this, but it's just how is it possible that, again, for me, as someone who didn't grow up a Christian, the more I read about Christianity, the Christianity I see from, let's say, the right-wing mega crowd is just, it's alien. This is not for me what Christ preached. Christ, it has nothing to do with love. It's vitriolic. It's hateful, and like, again, just would you blame Protestantism for this? Like, how is it that Christianity, in some sense, has become the metaphysical scaffoldings for neoliberal capitalism in the West? And I mean this in the West because I don't think this is the case globally. Uh, how is it that when we think of a Christian now, we think of like unfortunately, like a Trumpian figure who's some kind of a neo-fascist.
Yeah,
Like, just how do you think we got here in some sense?
Yeah, I think a lot of things in Christian history are a result of unforeseen bad choices. A lot of unforeseen bad choices among early church fathers and among early councils. And the case with Protestantism is sort of just an offshoot of sort of that like late medieval scholastic philosophy, where everything is reduced down to the individual, and everything is reduced down to, I mean, you kind of start seeing ideas of market economies being developed in late scholasticism, even before Adam Smith. So I mean, even you could maybe tie that into, but yeah, definitely the idea of the individual. It was just like this obsession that these late scholastic thinkers in the 15th, 14th century had with this idea of the individual. And it was just unforeseen in early Christian history. You just don't find that. And I think when people think of themselves as individuals, they want to look better than other individuals. They want to stand out, and they want to put down other individuals so that their individuality can be, raised up. And so I think that's how you get a lot of this idea that Christians should put down other people because they're trying to be like the most, good individuals. Which, I mean, of course, I think it's a pretty naive notion to think that Christianity is all about complete acceptance of all sin. I mean, sin is bad, and sin takes you away from God. And so I don't think Christians should accept sin, and they should reject sin. But rejecting sin does not involve rejecting the person. It doesn't involve turning to your own pride, thinking you're better than someone else. And it definitely doesn't involve like trying to outcast someone over something they can't control. So
yeah, Hunter, I completely concur. In fact, Trey was talking about pride. I think pride truly is one of the worst forms of sin because it's I would even argue, like, at least for myself, I don't want to pretend to be a saint. I am mostly prideful in life, as in it's really hard to not think you're better than other people.
it is.
I find it quite, because in so many ways that kind of arrogance seeps in being human, and which is why, like, I mean, I hope I don't offend people by saying, I'm sure I'm gonna, but when sometimes when people say, "Oh, I'll pray for you," I find some, not all the time, of course, I'm not that cynical, but people do come from like a supercilious, patronizing kind of way that, oh,
yeah,
look at you, you're fallen, you're below me, I'm gonna pray for you and help you. And I find that I get quite turned off by that, and I certainly see what you mean by that. I think pride it has a lot to do with it. Alrighty.
I think we covered a lot more from like the political aspects of from that essay. But is there anything else you think you want to mention regarding Christian socialism that I think we didn't touch on? Um,
I'm trying to think about that essay. I haven't looked at it in a while.
in fact, there's one part I want to ask you on. You said on the introduction, um, you say the Christian socialist feels alienated in contemporary times.
Yeah.
And what do you mean by that idea that a Christian socialist is alienated in our society?
Yeah. I think I remember, I'm pretty sure I said, I'm trying to think. Okay.
Let me try to read it out if you want.
Okay, what I mean is that I think that Christians and socialists both see the Christian socialist as like an outsider. And so the Christian socialist doesn't really have like a political group they can be a part of, because Christians, run-of-the-mill Christian is not a socialist, and your socialist, run-of-the-mill socialist is not a Christian. And so Christian socialists kind of find themselves like one foot in both camps, and both camps don't want them. So that's kind of what I mean there. And yeah, that's what I mean.
Beautifully put, beautifully put. Yes, in fact, just for the listener, if I could read out the introduction, it starts off like this. It says, the Christian socialists cannot help but feel a tinge of sorrow when they see the abundant support for free market capitalism among American Christians. To our fellow Christians, we are a contradiction. To our fellow socialists, we are an anomaly of a species. The Christian socialist is alienated from both camps they identify with. Then you go on saying, as an Eastern Orthodox Christian socialist, I'm even more alienated from both camps than most. Yet, this alienation has not stopped me, and I'm glad it hasn't, because you produced this essay. Okay, so let's. I mean, I know we touched on universal salvation. We were discussing your book, but
Yeah,
I
my
want to.
bad. I started going into it too much. I should have waited.
Oh,
Too
no,
much
no, no. That's
apologies.
totally fine. I mean, look, regardless, this is people are gonna hopefully listen to the whole thing, so that whatever they want to get from this, they can get.
Yeah.
And again, I'll leave the link to the papers down below. Although Hunter, again, as I did mention before, this is, after all, the majority of listeners are going to be secular,
Mhm.
so we need to. I think it makes sense to kind of understand some concepts and at least try and articulate some concepts that pertain to universal salvation. Starting off with the idea of hell. I mean,
Mhm.
what in the world is hell? Like
Yeah.
is it some place on earth, like
Yeah.
underground? So perhaps you could give us a bit of an introduction as to how you understand hell and how
Yeah.
perhaps Christianity has understood the idea in the history of the church.
Yeah. So, in the East, hell has always been understood as one's experience of God that is bad. It's so a wicked person experiences God, and a virtuous person experiences God in the afterlife. But for the wicked person, it's not a good experience, and for the virtuous person, it is a good experience. The West kind of took this idea that hell is this other place, that it's like a place away from God. And you see this a lot in, like a lot of medieval accounts of hell are like, God is like up here and hell's like down here, right? He's like up there, he's like looking at you, kind of like laughing, right? And hell's like down here. And so you don't really find that in the East. You always find this idea, even among non-universalist fathers in the East, it's still this idea that the wicked soul is experiencing God and the virtuous soul is experiencing God. It's just two different experiences, right? Um, and so that's kind of the idea that most Christians that are academically involved in this debate take, whether or not they're universalist or not universalist. Like one of the major texts that sort of cemented this view was C.S. Lewis's text. Everyone knows C.S. Lewis. He wrote Narnia, and so he had a text in 1948 called 44 called The Great Divorce, and the whole idea was it's this fiction. If you read Lewis, he kind of writes like it's a very fictional text. He has characters and he has plot points and climaxes and resolutions, and it's like reading a fiction book, but in that fiction book there is a theological arc to it, which I don't find very enjoyable, but some people do. But the idea for him is that two people are both on a train, right? And one of the and both of those trains are God, like you're experiencing God. That's the train. You're experiencing God on both trains, but one person is experiencing God having a really bad train ride. One person's having a really good train ride, but they're both experiencing God. And so that's kind of the image that you'll find, is that a lot of Protestant theologians now will be like, yeah, hell is obviously not like a different place from God. It's just one's experience of God. And again, East has always held this view. So I take this view. I think this is a very fine view. I think it makes a lot of sense to me. And but I think that this view, it seems to just sort of logically involve the idea that eventually that wicked person's experience will eventually be a good experience. If we take that God's love and experience of him as cleansing, and it's this like love that's pouring into you, I think that eventually even that wicked soul experiencing God will, over time, their experience is just going to get, more and more virtuous, more and more happy, more and more joy, until eventually all torment, all sorrow just disappears. And I think that's the best understanding of hell.
Beautiful. Okay, so the next thing, I think this is really important, the idea of agape, or the idea of universal love, God's love. So, yeah, I'll put it plainly. What does it mean for God to love all of creation universally?
Yeah. I think it means without partiality. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 13. A lot of people call it the love chapter. It's just kind of him talking about love, and it's a really cool chapter if you just want to read like a really nice poem about love, basically. And Paul talks about how love is long-lasting, never-ending, and never partial. And a lot of later Christians are like, Paul's not just talking about love in the way that we understand it between like two people. He's talking about God, right? God is love. So if you take that Paul's talking about God in this, then you would say that God's love is never ending. God's love is never lasting. God's love is everlasting. God's love is never partial. And so this is the way that I think you would understand universal love, is that it's never partial. And God desires the salvation for all, as 2 Timothy 2:4 says. And that salvation for all manifests in very different ways at very different points along the journey, but eventually it will manifest for everyone. So yeah.
Beautifully put. Yes. Well, you did mention C.S. Lewis, and before we get a bit more into the idea of universal salvation, the famous quote by C.S. Lewis, that the doors of hell are locked on the inside. So if someone just mentioned that to you apropos salvation, how would you respond to that quote by C.S. Lewis?
Well, first I would think, oh, okay, so this person's been reading a lot of Reddit. You see that a lot. You see that a lot on Reddit sites about like, how do I respond to universalists? So like this person reads a lot of Reddit. But the next thing I would think is, there's kind of philosophical ways to approach this. I call this the argument of perpetual sin. I call his argument the argument of perpetual sin, which the idea is basically that C.S. Lewis believes, and many other Christians today that believe in eternal hell. They think that hell will only exist because there will be certain people who will forever reject God. So their idea is that the doors of hell are locked from the inside. The person has locked themselves in hell. They've thrown away the key, and they don't want to accept God. God is right there calling out to them, and they just want to remain in that wrath and wickedness. So I kind of bring up a philosophical problem with this that I think is pretty obvious. The person that believes this says that God and sin will be never ending. So God is everlasting and sin is everlasting. Okay, if this is true, then God hasn't defeated sin and death. Throughout Paul's writings, Paul always talks about how God will defeat sin and death. 1 Corinthians 27, death and sin are destroyed. The wages of sin is death. In Romans, the whole idea is that death and sin are not forever. They will be destroyed, right? And so to have sin as this perpetual ongoing sin occurring would contradict that idea that death and sin will be destroyed. It's saying that sin is just as powerful as God. Sin's going to keep going and God's going to keep going. There will be some people who love their sin more than God. Then you get into more fundamental questions. Is it reasonable to think that someone would love sin more than God, given infinite opportunities? Well, we can approach this from You can approach this mathematically, really. You can say, okay, let's take an infinite number of possible worlds. Let's put, I don't know how many people are in hell. There's been 110 billion people that have lived on this earth. Let's say 60 billion are in hell. That's about half the world. 60 billion are in hell. Let's take an infinite number of possible worlds. 60 billion are in hell. It is mathematically like the percentage is like mathematically close to zero. That at least one person or all people would not eventually exit, right? If given an infinite number of possible worlds and 40, 60 billion people and an infinite number of time, it is mathematically like proven that all people will eventually exit. So I mean, you can take this from like a mathematical viewpoint. I do that in one of my philosophical chapters. But I think that just talking to people, just straightforward, just being like, does that make sense? Like, do you think that someone would love God, would love sin more than God, given an infinite number of opportunities? Like, to me, that just seems absolutely absurd on the face of it. So I think there's a couple of ways to approach this, but I think that either way, the universalist has the obviously true argument. So,
all right.
yeah.
So, again, colloquially, just putting it colloquially, universalism. So, I'm assuming you're claiming, and you do claim this in the essay, that even a Pol Pot or an Adolf Hitler
Yeah.
will eventually, be saved and be in heaven. So, I mean, when we think in the modern world, when we think of, what typifies evil, it's a Hitler or a Stalin or a Pol Pot, right? I mean, it's or a Jeffrey Epstein, just vile.
In my book, I actually use Jeffrey Dahmer as an example.
Jeffrey Dahmer. I mean, I know,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
This is like, I mean, you can't even fathom that's kind of
Yeah, I say, I wrote this quote. I thought it was so good. I say, even Jeffrey Dahmer will be exalted eternally in blissful paradise.
I love it. That should be a poster or like bumper.
It's pretty, yeah. But no, so my point is just to kind of rattle some feathers here. Whoa, well, even Hitler, Hitler and Pol Pot. Yeah. I mean, if you want to get philosophical with it, the idea that someone should be punished infinitely for a number of sins, there's a failure of parallel here because no one can commit an infinite number of sins. It's impossible. It's an infinite number of sins. We have finite lives. But an infinite time frame of being in hell, that doesn't seem to follow. If no one can commit an infinite number of sins, then no one should take an infinite time of hell. No matter how many sins you commit, it's never going to be as much as infinity, which it'd never be as much as how many sins would take to constitute hell. And I even give this devil's advocate position to in my book when I give this example in a more drawn out philosophical way, as I say, well, let me grant for a second that someone could actually remain in hell forever and they should deserve it. And I say the only way that someone would deserve hell is if they committed an infinite number of sins. But because nobody can commit an infinite number of sins, nobody deserves eternal hell. So I give that like devil's advocate position where I'm like, let's grant for a second. Like, let me think for a second. What would I think would constitute eternal hell? Well, if someone committed an infinite number of sins, then that would seem to constitute eternal hell. I mean, if you infinite number of sins, infinite sentence, but because that can quite literally never happen by nature of the finite lives that we live, I think that it's silly that Hitler and Pol Pot are thought to be eternally damned. So.
Well, yes. Look, okay, Hunter, I know that you brought up those names somewhat to rattle some feathers, as you said. But let's, in the context of time. So, is it the idea that there's like an eventual some sort of theosis that happens with these figures, and then there's I see that. So it's what
that's for everybody. Yeah.
Everybody.
I believe that hell in some sense will exist for a lot of people. A lot of people will be in hell. They'll experience the wickedness of their life being directed back onto them in the life to come. But that will eventually cede. That will eventually cede because that experience of God is just an experience of love pouring into them. And eventually that love will cleanse their wickedness, cleanse their soul. And I think with someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, Pol Pot, and Hitler, that's going to take a very long time, much longer than just your run-of-the-mill, wicked person who sins a lot, right? But I think that even them will definitely be saved.
I see.
Yeah.
So this again got me curious. I mean, again, I haven't got much of a knowledge on Christian history, which I probably should, given it's we are all in some sense Christians in a Christian culture. Well, not anymore. At least our roots are there. So where did the idea of hell come from, really? I mean, is it Dante? I mean, we all know Dante's Seven Circles of Hell. I mean, everyone's read Dante from a secular thinker. Dante is all time goat, right? And then
Yeah.
so is it Aquinas? Where do we have these ideas of hell that is so prevalent even in our secular culture?
Yeah. So I recently read a really good book by Megan Henning. I think it's from 2021. It's her book called Tours of the Afterlife, Early Christians and Hell, I believe. I don't remember exactly what it's called. I think that's what it's called. But she makes the argument, I think it's really, really, really well made, is that the idea of hell sort of developed out of an understanding of Roman penal punishment being directed into the afterlife. So everything that would happen to Roman prisoners became what would happen to you in the afterlife. When we look at early Christian apocrypha written in like the 3rd and 4th century about hell, we see exactly that. We see people being gouged their eyes out for eternity. We see people being flayed, their skins flayed, right? And so this idea of these Roman penal practices are kind of projected, to use a Freudian term, into the afterlife. And that's kind of what Dante draws from. A lot of people think Dante, kind of created that. No, he really just kind of systematized it or topologized it by creating different layers. But you do have this definitely by the 4th century in Christianity, maybe 3rd, but definitely 4th, is this different, like this idea of hell as based on Roman penal practices. And I think that argument makes a lot of sense to me. And Hannah Arendt, in her essay on authority that I talk about a little bit in my book at one point, she even talks about how hell was largely based off of Roman ideas of punishment. She's very quick. It's like a one-liner she says in her essay on authority. But like I was like, whoa, like that's a really good point. And then I read Megan Henning's book, and I was like, yeah, I mean that makes sense to me. So yeah, I think like most unfortunate circumstances in Christianity, people are looking towards the state as sort of their salvation, and that state does bad things, and then they see that state as like a holy beacon, and so then that becomes projected into the afterlife, what the state does.
So it was yet another political mishap in Christian history.
100%. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, I'll find those books and I'll leave them in the description down below too. All right, this was a very interesting part of your essay, Hunter, the part on St. Augustine, and you discussed the idea, those in heaven, can they be ignorant? So, for instance,
I build this out a lot more in my book. Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the argument you make is, well, if like for instance, if my loved ones, my family, my partner, if they're in hell and I'm in heaven, how can I have eternal bliss when I know the people I love the most are suffering in hell, unless I'm a sadist of some sort? So firstly, what are your critiques? I know St. Augustine is a controversial figure in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but firstly, what are your critiques of St. Augustine's kind of ideas of heaven and hell? And then why do you claim that those in heaven can't be ignorant of those in hell going through eternal torture and suffering?
Yeah. So I think Augustine, a lot of people don't know this, but Augustine in his early life was a universalist. He was a universalist for quite a good bit. He was influenced by Saint Ambrose, and Ambrose was a universalist. He actually baptized him. And so when Augustine converted to Christianity, he became a universalist. And we have many of his writings on universalism. His commentary on Genesis is one. But towards the end of his life, he grew to be a very bitter man, unfortunately. And he started developing probably the consequentially worst eschatology in the entire early church, which was this idea of semi-predestination. A lot of people think of predestination being associated with John Calvin, the idea that there are people who were made to be eternally damned and people who were made to be eternally saved. But Augustine kind of lit the match for that, unfortunately. And so much of later Augustine, I just kind of dismiss as just the bitter writings of an old man. But I like really Augustine, and I think that his Confessions is, of course, a very beautiful text that just kind of talks about his journey to Christianity. So his idea here is his idea here is that if the saved were to know that the damned were experiencing torture, that they themselves would be unable to experience the bliss of heaven. That's kind of the way his argument works. So I kind of approach this from two different ways. One of them is to say, what would it mean for there to be a block on knowing what was happening to the damned in hell, for instance, your family members? And I term this a fundamental epistemic block, FEB, as I abbreviate it in my book. And what I try and do is I explain the qualitative difference between ignorance and what I call fundamental epistemic block. Ignorance is like, I open the fridge and I forget I had beer, and I open the fridge and there's a beer, and I'm like, wow, cool. Like, I was ignorant, I had beer, and I saw beer, and now we're, not ignorant. Or I hear something on the news about at the southern border is the example I give, and I didn't know it was happening, and then I learned it was happening, and now I'm no longer ignorant. That's a normal way we use ignorant in like colloquial speech. So a fundamental epistemic block would be that there is a perpetually created ignorance that is maintained by God for all the saved. So my main point with this is, well, there's two texts in scripture I point to, but the philosophical argument is that if we believe that that free will in some sense exists, not libertarian free will, but just free will, like, I can do actions, and those actions have consequences, and I can influence those actions with my mind, just basic like that. Then if we create this fundamental epistemic block on the saved, this entails that there very well could be choices made by the saved that they wouldn't have taken if they didn't have this fundamental epistemic block, which is to say that God is taking away the free will of humans, which is then to say that I'm inverting the common argument against universalism, that it takes away free will, by showing that if we have that fundamental epistemic block, truly our free will is being taken away. Because if someone is fundamentally ignorant of something, then this precludes that there are all these different options. Think of like a tree where you're at the bottom, and all these roots are springing up different options you could take at any possible moment. Well, an infinite number of those options at any possible moment are cut off because that person is fundamentally kept in ignorance of the suffering that is going on, right? So this is the argument I take. It's pretty successful, I think. So yeah, that's
Briefly put. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Excellent. The next one is Hunter. Well, how for time? We've got about 10 more minutes remaining. I think we just get through this. So
sure.
I found it fascinating, your idea of the paradox of spiritual life, where there's this line. I'll read it out, a short excerpt. You say, "The paradox of belief is understood when one begins to engage in a spiritual life and notices how the closer they feel to God, the more they believe that every little thing they do is failing him." So how do you understand this paradox of belief?
Yeah. So when I was writing that, I had definitely had Lacan's objecta in mind. And I think that I want to write more about this, is incorporating the idea of the objecta in the spiritual life. And what I remember thinking at the time was, there's an ever persistent, when you're growing closer to God, there's still an ever persistent lack that separates you from the divine. That can never be crossed. Because you can never, know everything about God. And so each moment that you learn more about God and you're chipping away that part of your fallenness and growing in God and all theosis and all that, you are still maintaining this ever-present lack that follows you through every step of your spiritual journey. And what I was thinking is that, in some sense, and in like a very Hegelian sense, this negativity structures that positivity. So that lack structures the spiritual journey itself. Because without that lack, there would be no spiritual journey, because you would already know everything, right? You would know God and everything. But that lack allows you to maintain ignorance of God. And that lack is that ever-present ignorance between your relationship with God that I think could be understood to really like be the basis of a spiritual journey. So that's kind of what I was thinking with that.
Beautiful. So you kind of dialectize the lack itself, you say.
Yeah.
This lack has a positive ontic status. Excellent.
Mhm.
Well, on the note, I mean, I've asked this question from Trey too, but I want to ask this from you too. So I don't know how long you'll need to answer this, but perhaps in an elementary level, what's your ontology of faith? Yet another very important concept, a critical concept for being a Christian or a believer in any sense. But what's
Yeah.
your understanding of faith and your ontology of faith in that sense?
I mean, it's gonna be pretty short. I haven't really thought much about it. I really haven't. I mean, I guess I could go into like the difference between like faith and reason. Like I think faith kind of I think faith is kind of the basis of reason, because you have faith that your reasoning is accurate, right? And there's always, what Kierkegaard says, there's always a leap of faith, you can say, to reason. So there's always like when you're reasoning and you think that like you're being rational, there's always a faith that like you could be wrong. You have faith that you're right. You have faith that your reasoning is accurate, which in some sense can get into certain arguments for Christianity. Would be like, well, rather than just having faith that our reasoning is accurate, we should have an account for why our reasoning is accurate, which would be God. God is our account for why reasoning is accurate, because reason is given by a divine agency that is perfect and all that. So that's a way someone could take that. But I mean, yeah, I would just say that I think faith is sort of the structure to everything. I mean, everything we do is in some sense predicated off faith. So,
Yeah, I mean, I like Žižek's Kierkegaardian notion of faith, where he says, the Christian idea is not that I see religion A, religion B, religion C. I systematically
Yes.
like quantify
I
everything.
like that a lot.
Therefore, B is the correct one. It's like no. You become a Christian once you take the leap of faith, and you are a Christian.
Yep.
Then you see the truths of Christianity revealed to yourself. It's not.
Yep.
It's always retroactive in that sense. It's not.
Yep. 100%.
Yeah, and
100%.
I completely concur with that. Even in a secular sense, it makes total sense. Like, Hume's good old problem of induction, right? So how do we
Yeah.
know the sun is supposed to rise tomorrow? That the idea. Well, like subjectively, faith constitutes what it means to be a subject. If not, it's just kind of impossible to exist in this world. And I guess the way you could theologically argue for that is that, well, yes, we need some ground of being like a god to ensure that this faith has some validity to it, because if not, it's kind of like madness. What do you have faith in? Like nothing. So it's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, look, Hunter, I think those are the points that I wanted to touch on, really. I again, you're such a good writer, mate. Like, you're a clear writer. I've been trying to write a book for the past 4 years, and making very little progress at it. So I'm not gonna lie, I'm a bit envious as to how much of a good writer you are. But yes, do you think from the two topics, universal salvation and Christian socialism, do you think any points that we missed for this conversation? Any points worth mentioning before we conclude?
I think. Maybe I could maybe say like a little bit about how to present universal salvation to someone that like is against it in like a very like elementary way.
Please do.
So when I talk to like my Christian friends, because most people know I'm a universalist now, it's kind of gotten around around like my church I go to around college, and so when I get questions about it, because
sorry to interrupt, but I'm assuming your church, not everyone there is a universalist, right? It's not.
No, so I go to a pretty small school, and the city I'm in, we don't have an Orthodox church, so I just go to a Roman Catholic church.
I see. Okay.
And so I'm really involved with like the parish life there and stuff.
Catholicism. Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't live in a big enough city to have Orthodox here, but
Orthodox. Yeah.
yeah. But so one of the ways that I try and explain it to people is like just like a very basic thing, like how much do you love God? And they're like, well, I love God a lot. I'm like, well, do you think that everyone loves God? They're like, well, some people don't act like they do. And I'm like, but what if someone was given enough time to love God? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, let's think about our lives. We have maybe 75 to 95, hopefully 95 years on this earth, right? And I'm like, that's not a lot of time in the grand scheme of things to really like find God and love him. And they're like, well, I guess that makes sense. And I'm like, wouldn't it make much more sense if that love of God was always open for all people forever and ever? And a lot of them are like, I mean, I guess that would make sense. It's just, it just seems that 75 years is not a lot of time. And even if they do believe in praying for the dead, which a lot of Catholics and Orthodox do, some still are like, well, some prayers are only so like efficacious. Some prayers will not reach everyone, right? Like some people will be prayed for no matter what, they still, for whatever reason, won't, make paradise. And I just have to be like, then we should pray more. We should just pray more then. We should just pray more for them. And yeah, and just think about how much love that your prayer is giving to them and how much they're receiving that love and how much more love is being poured out from God than just your prayer. And then I'm like, with your prayer and God's love being poured out onto them, who is going to forever reject this? So that's kind of a very elementary approach to how to explain universal salvation to someone who's maybe not the most philosophically inclined and is against it. So
Lovely, lovely. Well, I can't think of a better place to end our dialogue. Thank you, Hunter. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, once again.